UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's Conservatives are widely expected to lose the Labour Party in Thursday's election. The Conservatives have been in power for 14 years under 5 prime ministers. However, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has dismissed suggestions that his party is heading to defeat. Mr. Sunak has used one of his final televised appearances to defend the Conservatives' record on the economy. His main opponent, 61-year-old Labour leader Keir Starmer, is seen as a centrist and pragmatist. Critics call him unexciting and unambitious, but Labour has surged in popularity under his leadership. I sat down with Nathaniel Ogunniyi, who is a Young Voices UK commentator. Nathaniel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course, happy to be here.
Now, what do you make of Mr. Sunak's claims that he can pull off a win in the final days of this campaign?
Well, I think it takes a lot of belief. It takes a lot of belief to see that happening. I think there is positive news for him in that Labour's position is at the weakest it's been for just over 2 years. So if you look at the polls conducted over the last few days, they tell you that actually Labour isn't doing very well, but it doesn't currently seem to be leaking votes to the Conservative Party. It seems to be leaking them to, the Lib Dems and the Greens and all these other parties.
Now, some of the recent polls show that the Conservatives are not only far behind the Labour, but polling around some marks as the Reform UK. Who exactly are the Reform UK and how have they managed to surge in this election?
Oh gosh. So Reform UK was formed from the remnants of the Brexit Party. The Brexit Party was sort of formed in 2019, around the time that it looked like the UK's exit from the EU was in peril. And so they're sort of led by a gentleman called Nigel Farage. He used to be heavily involved in UKIP. He was a big advocate for the UK leaving the EU. And so Reform sort of runs on almost a common sense party angle. They're quite tough on migration. So they've called for net zero migration. So sort of the same number of people coming in and out of the country every year. Recently in the UK, we've had 700, 800,000 net migration. And so they're sort of calling for that to be zero. They've got some interesting policies around raising the income tax threshold. So lower paid workers wouldn't have to pay as much in income tax and things like that. And yeah, they're quite skeptical when it comes to the environment.
Now, with a Labour win on the horizon, what are some of the big issues Labour have campaigned on?
So one big issue that Labour have talked about is housing. They have pledged to deliver 1.5 million homes by the end of the next parliament. The parliament lasts 5 years. So it's about 300,000 homes a year, which is actually the same sort of target as the existing Conservative government. But Labour have pledged that they would reform planning rules, not just in housing, but but in transport, in energy and infrastructure. And so ensuring that projects that are viable can actually get built. So that's sort of one big thing they've campaigned on. Yeah.
And what do you make of their promises? Are they realistic and achievable?
So I suppose some of them are, more ambitious than others. So for instance, we look at Labour's pledges on, say, illegal migration, and they talk about having a sort of border security command, which is sort of the same as what we've got right now. It's just got a different logo and maybe a different uniform. So there are areas where there are question marks over their policy. Equally, a lot of their spending plans rely on growth that we have not quite seen in the last 5 or so years, and so it's difficult to see how their spending plans could be achieved without raising taxes. And indeed, that's something that the Conservative Party have jumped on. The figure used is about £2,000, but there's a suggestion that Labour would have to raise taxes in order to compensate for that.
And Nathaniel, what do you think is the main reason for the downfall of the Tories?
Oh gosh, you could probably write a Bible about that. So I think over the last few years, there have been a number of difficulties. There has, of course, been the coronavirus pandemic. There was the UK's exit from the EU. There was the invasion of Ukraine and what that did to energy prices and therefore the cost of living. And so over the last few years, I'd say there's been a fair amount of difficulties that the government have had to deal with. And so that's one thing. I suppose coming off the back of 14 years in government is also not easy. Every time you say, oh yeah, we do something or we think this is a good idea, the question mark that comes back to you is, okay, but why haven't you done that already? And so that's a question that Rishi Sunak has found quite difficult to answer.
Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today.
With pleasure.